The purpose of this presentation is to provide the audience with information on what the school-to-prison pipeline is, who is disproportionately impacted by it, and why this is occurring using social psychology and school psychology research from the literature. The presenters conclude with potential evidence-based strategies to dismantle this pipeline and decrease prejudice within schools. Both presenters are currently advanced doctoral students within the University of Cincinnati's School Psychology program.
So before we really dive in and use some jargon, we wanted to go over the background and definitions. So social justice is a term that is not easily defined, but it's associated in education with the idea that all individuals and groups must be treated with fairness and respect, and that every student is entitled to resources and benefits that the school has to offer. There are laws in place, such as ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act, and other things like that, that support this social justice piece. However, they are not always implemented the way that we would like them to be implemented, as we will discuss later. The school-to-prison pipeline role in this refers to controversial school policies and practices that lead students, especially those who are considered at risk, out of the regular school environment and into more restrictive settings. This includes the juvenile justice system and alternative education programs or placements, such as alternative high school settings and other programs. Most frequently, the school-to-prison pipeline has been shown to affect male students and youth with disabilities or minoritized people, including African Americans and Latinx. Moving on to the zero tolerance policy, while it may sound like a good idea that a school has zero tolerance for something, it's actually very harmful. This policy and policies like this rely on exclusionary discipline practices, including out-of-school suspension or expulsion, which removes students from the classroom and schools as a form of punishment, usually for minor offenses like disruptions, defiance, and disrespect. Those three words are very subjective, have little operational definitions, and are not inclusive of all cultures, as we know that respect, defiance, and disruption, those terms change depending on time, place, setting, and cultural backgrounds. In addition to zero tolerance policies, a significant number of under-resourced schools, public schools, have chosen to employ student and school resource officers. The SROs deal with disciplinary and behavioral issues. With an increased presence of SROs and police officers in school, research in certain school districts has indicated that there have been more school-based arrests for nonviolent criminal offenses, such as disorderly conduct. Once again, as indicated by these reports, a disproportionate number of school-based arrests have targeted ethnic minority or minoritized students, and as indicated above, CRDC data from the Department of Education OCR in 2012 revealed that more than 70% of students were referred to law enforcement agencies nationally were either African American or Latinx students. In school districts that use zero tolerance policies, CRDC data also indicated that African American and Latinx students made up 45% of the student body, but represented 56% of total expulsions under these policies. All of the information that I have just stated can be found at NASP.com, the website, the National Association of School Psychologists. Most recently, the 2013-14 Civil Rights Data Collection documented that overall, Black students make up 16% of enrollment, but accounted for 40% of suspensions nationally. That is an extreme discrepancy.
The racially disparate impact of these policies has been documented for decades. For example, the proportion of Black students receiving an out-of-school suspension has risen 120% since 1975, whereas the proportion of white students receiving an exclusionary discipline consequence has only grown 64%. The U.S. Department of Education reported in their civil rights data collection that Black students are 3.5 times more likely than their white classmates to be suspended or expelled from school. Nearly 1 in 5 Black males and more than 1 in 10 Black females received an out-of-school suspension. This begs the question, why are Black students disproportionately affected by the school-to-prison pipeline? To attempt to answer this question, we will take an interdisciplinary approach and draw from both social and school psychology research. Afterwards, we will pose and offer several evidence-based solutions and resources an educator or school resource officer may use in the field.
While there are several things that could make up for these discrepancies that we're seeing, implicit biases and stereotypes are of the more likely to be causing this gap and causing these out-of-school suspensions and discipline rates. So one possible explanation for the disproportionality of Black students within the school-to-prison pipeline comes from the social psychology research on implicit bias. Implicit bias, by definition, are implicit attitudes that are unidentified or inaccurately identified traces of experience that create favorable or unfavorable feeling, thought, or action. Another possible explanation comes from implicit stereotype bias. Stereotypes are socially shared sets of beliefs and traits that are characteristics of a member of a social category. These stereotypes guide judgment and action to the extent toward another person as if the person possesses those traits included in the stereotype. The judgment and action may be conscious, and stereotypes themselves being automatic adaptive mechanisms. Even so, negative stereotypes, like, for example, Black people or students being more violent or aggressive or criminal, has very serious ramifications and consequences within both analog and real-world settings. Within analog lab settings, Carell and colleagues gathered participants to see how implicit stereotypes impact each participant's judgment in a video game modeling the police officer's dilemma. Participants were tasked with the quick decision to shoot avatars they believed to be armed versus those that were unarmed. The avatars were either Black or white men. The authors reasoned that individuals would fire more quickly in situations that were stereotype consistent. Armed Black suspects due to stereotypes of these individuals being violent and unarmed whites, compared to situations that were stereotyped inconsistent, armed white man versus unarmed Black man. The results of Study 1 validated this hypothesis as participants had quicker reaction times for situations that were stereotype consistent. To make matters worse, individuals had lower decision criteria for shooting Black suspects and mistakenly shot unarmed Black suspects at higher rates. These findings, we believe, can be generalized into the classroom for teachers and their split decision-making on whether or not to take disciplinary action against Black students. These implicit biases and stereotypes could be what is causing this discrepancy, and based off of this study, it seems that we could generalize this information to draw some of those correlations. Furthermore, the work of Skiba et al. In 2011 is among the most convincing. The authors draw upon administrative data from 436 schools across the country in 2005 and 6, looking at differences in discipline for quote-unquote minor behavior. They find that Black and Hispanic students were more likely to be disciplined, conditional on receiving a referral for minor misbehavior than their white peers. Steinborn and Lecoq note a shortcoming of this work is its inability to control for students' prior disciplinary records, suggesting that might explain justifiable differences in severity of punishment for similar infractions. In this case, that would overestimate discrimination's impact, but one could also argue that the behavior for which the student was referred was itself an outgrowth of discrimination, and that Skiba et al. Underestimate the role of discrimination. This was found on a website from brookings.edu, and it's important to note that it's unlikely overall that student behavior would be uniform across people and different races and ethnicities. However, there is a strong correlation between the discipline rate gap. For example, the inability to control the student's prior disciplinary records, well, those disciplinary records could also be higher compared to white peers because of this ongoing cycle and systemic issue that we're seeing in schools.
The proposed solutions to address the disproportionality is twofold. The first being further research into alternative methods to discipline and conflict resolution, such as restorative justice practices. The second being greater education and awareness for educational staff and school resource officers on how implicit bias impacts decision-making, especially during times of escalation and crisis.
So, alternative disciplinary practices. There are promising new shifts that have occurred as school districts begin moving away from exclusionary practices towards those focused on building relationships and treating discipline as an opportunity to support students' healthy social emotional development. Relationship building strategies can include positive, consistent communication and contact with caregivers about their child's behavior. These also include brief greetings when the students arrive to check in, or a larger time commitment of an advisory period for students to stop by and build rapport with the teachers. Making positive relationships in schools is very important for students, especially students coming from parents who have a distrust in school based off of their own experience. Restorative justice measures used to address student misbehavior in schools are similar to the approaches used in the criminal justice system that effectively focus on repairing the harm caused by crime by involving offenders, victims, and the community through conferences that often sanction community service or restitution rather than with punishments that encourage recidivism. Within the restorative justice model in schools, student misbehavior is viewed as a violation of a relationship, either one between the offender and victim or one between the offender and the overall school community. In order to restore the harm caused, the offending student and those individuals whose trust was violated must reconcile, thereby mending this relationship.
Now, when it comes to education and training on what implicit bias is and how it impacts our behavior, activities within schools derived from decades of social psychology research should include increasing intergroup contact, working to foster greater empathy and perspective taking when interacting with others, engaging in open dialogue about issues of difference in order to increase compassion and dispel stereotypes, and reducing the salience of group boundaries by emphasizing the commonalities among groups are all ways in which we can teach both staff and students on what stereotypes are and how these impact our actions with each other. Additionally, teachers and school resource officers should also receive further educational opportunities around what implicit bias is, how to identify this bias, and hold an honest discussion of how these biases impact their interactions and decisions. around discipline when working with diverse populations. Staff may also benefit from workshops to strategize ways in which they can mitigate the impact of this bias on their interactions with students during times of crisis.